Hey girls, I am talking today about high intensity interval training and specifically what you need to know about HIIT after 40 because the rules do change when we hit that menopause period of hormonal chaos, and we need to do things differently than we once did. So I am going to take you through today how to do HIIT effectively for this age group, what to do, what to avoid, and the best practices for high intensity interval training for women over 40. So let's start by, if you are watching this live, I would love you to let me know. Just give me a quick wave so that I know that you can hear me and that you can see me. I am going to be starting to upload these videos onto YouTube as well. So if you happen to be watching the YouTube version of this, then I would love to know if you watched it as well, and let me know if you have any feedback as well. So just so you know, let's dive into first of all what the kind of definition of HIIT is. So HIIT is specifically high intensity interval training. Hey Meg, welcome. High intensity interval training. It's a protocol of exercise, obviously, where we're alternating short periods of intense or explosive anaerobic exercise as opposed to aerobic. So anaerobic is generally under 2 minutes in length. Aerobic is over 2 minutes, where we use our aerobic system, and brief recoveries of in between of those short intervals until the point of exhaustion often. So the idea is that we're really taxing, going all out effort, sort of maybe like 8 or 9 or even a 10 out of 10 in terms of the intensity level. And then we're doing brief periods of recovery in between. It is really supposed to be performed in repeated sort of short bursts of maximum or near maximum, as I said, effort, with those periods of rest in between. So it's different from aerobic exercise, or, kind of what we typically think of as cardio, in that it's a much higher level of intensity. And so it can't be sustained for long periods of time. So unlike, if you think about our typical sort of cardio activities like jogging or swimming or bike riding, where we can sustain that level of effort for quite a long period of time, high intensity interval training is supposed to be done in short, sharp bursts. I'm also going to be speaking today about sprint interval training, which is a bit of a variation on high intensity interval training. Its acronym is SIT, so as opposed to HIIT. I'm not sure if Stacey Sims coined the term, but she's very obviously well known in this kind of space of exercise and training best practices for women in perimenopause and menopause, and she talks about this a lot and its effectiveness for women over 40. What I do love about how we should be doing these things at this age is that we don't need to be spending as much time as most of you probably think that we do. We can do this, this is great for the time-pressed, busy woman who has got a lot on her plate. You don't need to be doing this for hours on end to get the maximum benefits. And in fact, it's much more effective when we do it for shorter periods of time. So I think that HIIT has gotten a bad rap for women in perimenopause or menopause because it can raise cortisol levels and keep them elevated. So in the same way that cardio or aerobic exercise can raise those cortisol levels and keep them elevated, so I'm not talking about short, sharp bursts, so it can be quite taxing on the adrenals. It can impact your hormones. It can drive up your hunger hormones. It can drive down your daily activity levels and energy, which is all detrimental, obviously. And it can also be catabolic, so it can break down muscle. And what we don't want to be doing at this age is losing muscle. So we want to be holding on to the muscle that we've got. But if done strategically, if done the right way, it can actually be very, very beneficial. So I will go into that in a moment. Now, I just wanted to touch first on cortisol for a little bit longer. I don't want to make this whole talk about cortisol, but I will touch on it for a minute because it's relevant to the conversation in terms of why HIIT and SIT have got a bad rap for women in perimenopause and menopause. And I feel like cortisol is like the hormone du jour. It's what certainly in kind of the circles that I'm mixing in and like looking at in Facebook groups for women over 40, everyone's talking about cortisol. We're all scared of cortisol being raised for a long period of time. Women often get told by other well-meaning women to get their cortisol levels checked if they're not losing weight and things like that. Which, for reasons I'll go into another time, I think that's a little bit of a waste of time. I think we can I'll go into it very briefly now because it's quick. I think we can all safely assume that if you're a woman over 40, you've probably got higher than optimal levels of cortisol, and we should all be putting in place some stress management techniques in order to manage those. So cortisol is our body's main kind of stress hormone. In and of itself, it is not a bad thing. In fact, it is an essential hormone. It's life-saving in some cases. We need it, and we do want it to be high in certain periods of time. It's our body's fight or flight mechanism, right? So it's part of adrenaline and cortisol to get us out of danger when we need it. We just don't want it to stay too high or too low throughout the day. We don't want it to be chronically high or chronically low. We want it to be cyclical to be in order to be optimal. So, as I mentioned, it's that body's fight or flight hormone during times of stress. That our hormones such as adrenaline, help us stay on high alert to avoid stress. So if you're about to get about to step out onto the road and get hit by a car, you're going to get this surge of adrenaline, which is going to make sure that you move quickly and you can get out of danger really quickly. It also triggers, cortisol is also linked with glucose, so it triggers the release of glucose from your liver for fast energy, because you might need to sprint away from something or move quickly. You need that kind of fast response, so it triggers that glucose to be released from your liver during times of stress, which, as you can probably imagine, becomes an issue if our cortisol is chronically elevated, because we don't want our liver to be constantly releasing cortisol into the bloodstream. Then we start to run into issues of, elevated glucose, insulin resistance, and the issues that they lead to as well. So that's not a good thing, because if cortisol is high, then our blood glucose is high, and vice versa. They work, together. Cortisol also has a role in regulating our metabolism, so helps control how our body uses fats and proteins and carbohydrates for energy, so it's important for that. It is actually responsible for suppressing inflammation if we get short spurts of it. So when you think about, those short spurts of cortisol where we get that cortisol response triggered and then it's back down again, that is great for limiting inflammation. But if it's consistently high, our body can get used to having too much cortisol, and then that can lead to chronic inflammation and a weakened immune system. So that's obviously not great. And then, of course, you may or may not know, but it's also very important in controlling our sleep-wake cycle. So, when cortisol is at optimal levels, it starts to rise just before we need to get up in the morning, so that we're more alert when we wake up. It starts to, take us out of that sleep state, and it works in reverse to melatonin. So when cortisol rises, melatonin drops, and vice versa. And then hopefully in the evening, cortisol is dropping, melatonin's rising, so we can get to sleep easily. That's in an optimal state. So that was just, a very brief summary of cortisol, why it is actually good in short bursts, but in chronic amounts, it's not helpful overall. Back to HIIT, or high intensity interval training. So when it now that we know this about cortisol, when it can become a problem is when we do HIIT or for intervals for too long a period. So either the intervals are too long, so we're trying to do this high intensity interval training, but it's going for like 2 or 3 minutes, or the entire session of HIIT is too long. So we just actually can't maintain that true high intensity, which is the purpose of HIIT. It's kind of bastardized to the point where it's no longer high intensity. It's medium, if that medium intensity, to even sort of moderate low intensity with short breaks. So we're never really fully recovered, and you can't really go all out in that next effort, which is how it was designed. So it becomes more like an aerobic or cardio exercise in that sense. And I've spoken about this in previous videos about how cardio can keep cortisol elevated chronically, and that can be have a negative impact on our body composition, on our energy, on our hormones, on our fat loss ability. So when we do HIIT in this sense, in this kind of moderate intensity way, instead of your cortisol rising and falling like we want it to, it actually just stays elevated. So if you imagine, let me put you in a scenario where this might happen. So for example, in a pump class or an old school aerobics class where we're kind of working hard, we're kind of puffing, but we could do it for a while. Like we're not going all out to where we're like smashed at the end of 30 seconds or 45 seconds and we need to recover. We can just kind of keep going at that rate for a while, even though it's somewhat hard. And then for most women, or a lot of women that I see, they go straight from this scenario of this moderate to high-ish, sort of semi-high intensity, where the cortisol is raised for that full 45 minutes or an hour. They race off to start the rest of their day to go home, get ready for work, or the kids ready, race off to work, race home from work to get the dinner ready, and blah, blah, blah. And the whole day is spent with the cortisol up here. There's no cycle, there's no rise and fall, there's no elevation and fall. This is where it can start to be a problem. And it's not even that, it's just the high intensity interval training in itself. If you went from that and then you were able to just down regulate and get some parasympathetic nervous system action into your day, probably wouldn't be so bad. But for the most part, that's not the reality of most women's days, that we are going from one thing to the next, we're rushing, we're busy, and HIIT is just adding to that chronic cortisol. So if that sounds familiar, let me know. I'd love to know in the comments if that is a familiar scenario where you're kind of used to just being sort of huffing and puffing for an entire hour, and then you race off to the rest of the day, and then you kind of feel like you're a bit exhausted all day, you're spent, you're hungry, you're tired. It's not ideal for fat loss or body composition across the board, or energy levels, mood, all the rest of it. So what do we want to do instead? So true HIIT, true high intensity interval training, should be short, hard bursts of about 30 to 45 seconds with a short break and short 15 to 20 seconds ish in between. And when I say hard, if you put your effort level on a scale of 1 to 10, and 1 being me right now sitting in a chair talking to you, like, I could do this all day. Hopefully you probably don't want me to, but I could. To 10 being like lying in puddles of sweat afterwards, like absolutely spent, couldn't go any harder if I tried, sort of like a 100-meter sprint effort, right? 100-meter sprinters, even the best in the world, can't keep up that intensity for 400 meters or 800 meters. That's all out effort. That's a 10. So we want to be looking at about an 8 or 9 out of 10 for high intensity interval training. And then the other thing to think about is how long is the overall session. So you can't possibly keep up that level of effort intensity for 45 minutes to an hour, which a lot of HIIT circuit style classes are. So we're doing it in short bursts. So we're going all out hard as you can for say 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off, and the whole thing might be 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes at the kind of longer end of HIIT. And that's relevant to your relative fitness level as well. At the start, your 10 out of 10 or your say 8 out of 10 is going to be very different to someone who's already super fit and has been doing this for a while. It's got to be relative to you. So it's all a personal thing, like how hard are you working personally, and then how fit you are is going to determine how many of those you can do. You may not be able to do 10 minutes of that high intensity interval training at the start. Another really effective form of, like as I mentioned earlier, of interval training though, is that sit interval. So the sprint interval training. So the difference between that and HIIT is that sit is really supposed to be that sprint level intensity. So that example I just gave of a 100-meter sprint, it's that sort of level of intensity, and it's shorter bursts, longer rests. So we're talking about an interval of 10 to 20 seconds. So really you're going as hard as you can for that 10 or 20 seconds. Mind you, even though it's called sprint interval training, you don't have to physically be sprinting. Like I've got a lot of clients who can't sprint, who can't run, but we can do things like rope slams are fantastic. Boxing is a great way of doing it. Ball slams, if you're in a gym on the rower, I don't love it on a treadmill, I just think it's a little bit dangerous, but assault bike, those sorts of things are really great for sprint interval training because you can give it that all out effort. And then we want a longer recovery. So by the end of the recovery, and it's usually 1 to 2 minutes of recovery, it seems like a long time. You'll be by the end, you'll be like, I'm bored now, I'm not used to recovering for this long, but we want to be able to fully recover to the point we can give that same effort again. So short period of time, longer rest. And those sprint intervals would be 10 minutes maximum. And like I said at the start, the beauty of this style of training is that you don't have to spend an hour to do it. I like doing sprint intervals after a strength session. So at the end of a strength session, so you might do strength and then maybe 5 minutes of sprint interval training, or 10 minutes maximum of say 20 seconds on, a minute to 2 minutes off, and you do that times 5. But you can do it separately to your strength training as well. But it's because it's so time effective, you could also tack it on to the end of a strength training session that you're already doing. The great thing about sprint interval training and HIIT, the way I've just described it as well, is that it's very effective for fat loss. So for women over 40, when we're dealing with more visceral fat because we're losing estrogen and we're more likely to store fat on around our organs in that tummy area, this is one of the forms of training that has good seems to have good evidence to show that this can actually target that visceral fat, as opposed to cardio, which is not going to be effective at all in that sense. So it also increases, as does strength training, mind you, it increases your afterburn effect. So the technical acronym, what did I just call that acronym, is EPOC. So excess post-oxygen consumption. So basically where your metabolism stays a bit elevated after you finish doing the exercise. So you're getting more calorie burn, that fueling that metabolic fire even after you finish training. Whereas cardio, in the aerobic sense of that sort of moderate intensity to low intensity, you're not getting any of that afterburn effect. You're burning some calories during, not probably as many as we think or we hope, but not afterwards. Whereas this high intensity sprint interval training, we're getting that afterburn effect for a long time afterwards, as well as strength training. I don't think I need to go into strength training in this session here because I've talked about that a lot. There's a lot of other videos we can go back to if you want to know the ins and outs of strength. But if you have any questions about HIIT training, about the high intensity interval training or the sprint interval training that I just spoke about, definitely leave them in the comments. Let me know if you've got any questions on that, and I will come back and answer them if I don't see them while you're on live. So thanks for joining me, girls. Nice to see those of you who are on here, and if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll see you soon. Bye.